So a very warm welcome to this afternoon's talk from our guest speaker Simon Miles. Peter Welsford, our chairman, can't be here today. He's not able to. He's a little bit immobile at the moment, but he sends his very good wishes. And it was he who persuaded Simon to give the talk. I'm standing in for Peter Welsford. I'm Susan McElroy. I do the administration. And traditionally, we at this point read out the objects of the society.
Over here? Okay. Among the objects for which the society is established, as expressed in the Memorandum of Association, are the following. To encourage, for the benefit of the public, the study of the works of Francis Bacon as philosopher, statesman and poet, also his character, genius and life, his influence on his own and succeeding times, and the tendencies and results of his writing. To encourage, for the benefit of the public, the general study of the evidence in favour of Francis Bacon's authorship of the plays commonly ascribed to Shakespeare, and to investigate his connection with other works of the Elizabethan period.
Okay, well, Peter sent me a little bit of information about Simon, and he tells me that Simon Miles and Walter Saunders, who's here all the way from Jersey, came to a talk at the University of London Senate House some years ago, and as a result of this, Simon became a member of the society and has given a talk. And another member said today that was the best talk she'd ever heard, right? So thank you, Simon. Peter says that when Simon came to see him at his house, he said, "Oh, you've got Foucault's pendulum." Is that how you say it?
Foucault's pendulum.
Foucault's pendulum. And you pointed that out, and of course Peter absolutely loves books of that ilk, so that was very, very, very good. The talk then today is "When Shall We Laugh? Say When? Francis Bacon and the Merchant of Venice." And in this talk, Simon will explore the historical background and literary sources of the Merchant of Venice, and present surprising new evidence pointing to Francis Bacon's authorship of the play. It follows from an earlier talk, which I mentioned, that he gave to the Society in 2009, in which he discussed the events surrounding the affair of the Dutch churchyard libel of 1593 and the connection to the first emergence of the names Marlowe and Shakespeare in relation to writing and the theatre. So it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Simon.
Yes. Thank you very much, Susan. Well, I'm absolutely delighted to be here today at the August Francis Bacon Society to present the talk. And in fact, the title has changed very slightly from the one that Susan read out. The name of my talk today is actually "When Shall We Laugh? Say When? Francis Bacon, Anthony Bacon, and the Merchant of Venice." Well, this is what I'm going to be talking about. This is the play of Merchant of Venice as it first appeared when it was first published in quarto form in 1600. And there's the cover as it appeared when it was printed. Written by W. Shakespeare, it says on the cover. Well, we're going to explore that a little this afternoon. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the play, The Merchant of Venice. It won't matter too much if you're not so familiar with it, but just to give a very, very brief overview, the main characters in the play are Antonio, Bassanio, Portia and Shylock. Antonio and Bassanio are the two male leads. Portia is the love interest, shall we say, and Shylock, of course, is the very famous Jewish moneylender. The play really consists of three intertwined plots: the plot of the bond, the plot of the caskets, and the plot of the ring. Today we're really going to be focusing on the first aspect, the plot of the famous bond, the pound of flesh. But the play is really broader than that. The play, as far as I've come to understand it, it's not even really about Venice. It's a play, a much more universal play. It's a play about the tension between the local and the foreigner or the stranger or the other in the city. So in a sense it represents the encounter in cities all over the world between the local and those that have come into the city. So I've always had a curious feeling when I've watched The Merchant of Venice. The plots all come to a very nice conclusion at the end. All the loose ends are very nicely tied up by the playwright. But nevertheless, it's a play which leaves questions hanging in the air, or certainly that's the sense that I get. For example, why does Shylock want the pound of flesh? This is something we're going to explore a bit more in this afternoon's talk. He's asked several times during the play, why is it that you want the pound of flesh? And he deflects the question every single time with a non-answer. So if you're paying attention when you watch the play, when you leave at the end of the night, the question hasn't been answered by the playwright. It's left hanging in the air. But it's by no means the only question. The specific relationship between Antonio and Bassanio is also something that is not specifically spelled out by the play. Now, there's lots of ideas people have had, but we're going to explore that a bit this afternoon. At the very beginning of the play, Antonio, the character, speaks about his sadness, and the entire first scene is a discussion about why he is sad. Again, the answer is never really determined in the play, and it's left hanging. There are other subsidiary questions that are raised. Bassanio, who is the character who needs to borrow the money, it's never actually explained why. Well, we know why he wants to borrow the money, but we don't really know why he fell into debt in the first place. And finally, the standard question that every essay topic sets for Merchant of Venice is it a comedy or a tragedy? It takes its place in the comedies in the first folio, but it's difficult to see sometimes quite what makes it a comedy. It's because it's a very serious play, and so the question mark hangs over as to why Shakespeare decided to characterise it amongst his comedies rather than the tragedies. So it's a play that leaves questions unanswered. But what I want to do this afternoon is explore what I've come to see as an invisible architecture or hidden scaffolding, if you like, behind this play. I've been thinking about this now for over 10 years, and in that time I've come to, my understanding of the play, I've come to realise that there's all kinds of behind-the-scenes things that are going on which give the structure to what's actually played out on stage. I've come to think of this play as made up of a series of layers, and in a sense it's only the top layer that's made visible. So the talk this afternoon is going to be divided into two parts. In the first part, we're going to look at these layers and explore the layers and see how they combine to create the characters and the plot of the play. And then once we've laid out these layers, we're going to move to part two, in which we're going to go into a little bit more depth and to trace the sources, the textual sources that the author has used in putting together the materials that make up the play. So one of the plots in the play is the plot of the caskets, and for those of you that are familiar with the play, the suitors come to Portia and have to choose between a gold, a silver and a lead casket. And these caskets, the winning casket contains a likeness of Portia. And whoever chooses the correct casket and finds the likeness of Portia wins her hand. Well, I've come to understand that there is, as it were, a fourth casket, a secret casket hidden in this play. What we might even call an Easter egg in the common parlance. So an Easter egg, do you know what an Easter egg is? Of course, I'm not talking about the chocolate Easter eggs. An Easter egg has come to mean a hidden joke or a hidden game that people inject these days into video games or movies or other works of art that are designed to be hidden there by the author to reward the curious. So I've come to understand that Merchant of Venice has indeed such an Easter egg or hidden compartment. And this secret casket, when we can find it and we can open it with the correct key, reveals the true identity of the author. Part 1, the layers. Well, I've decided to start with this lovely quote of Francis Bacon's. If a man will begin with certainties, he shall end in doubts. But if he will be content to begin with doubts, he shall end in certainties. So let's start today with a doubt. And what I'm going to doubt is a piece of accepted wisdom that has passed around Baconian circles for many years about this play. And it concerns an event where Francis Bacon was actually arrested himself for a debt. And it's been spoken on many occasions that there must be some connection between this arrest of Francis Bacon and the arrest of Antonio, which is at the heart of the Merchant of Venice. So let's have a look at that, and I want to explore that and show you that in fact it's absolutely impossible that Francis Bacon's arrest could have influenced the Merchant of Venice, and in a moment you'll see why. So Francis Bacon was arrested on September the 23rd, 1598. Throughout the 1590s, he was hopelessly in debt and constantly borrowing money. And on this occasion, he had borrowed money from a fellow called Giles Simpson, who was a goldsmith. He borrowed £300. Now, one day Bacon was involved with business for the Queen. He was part of a deputation that were interrogating a prisoner in the Tower. And as he was leaving the Tower on this day, September the 23rd, 1598, Giles Simpson had Bacon arrested for this debt. Now, in fact, there was still 2 weeks running on the debt. It wasn't actually due, but Giles Simpson decided to take this opportunity to have Francis Bacon arrested. And it got Francis in a bit of hot water. In fact, he could have quite easily been sent to the Fleet, but he was able to do some quick thinking, contact a friend of his, Sheriff Moore, whom he'd been dining with, and he was taken to a friend's house and he was able to send out a couple of letters to friends appealing for some money to get him out of this sticky situation. And the letters have survived. They weren't known for about 100 years, so at the time nobody knew about this, and there's no other information about this arrest except for these 2 letters. Well, the first of the letters he sent to Sir Thomas Egerton, Lord Keeper of the Great Seal. And I've got a couple of quotes from these letters. I'll read it out. I am to make humble complaint to your lordship of some hard dealing offered me by one Simpson, a goldsmith. For this Lombard, pardon me, I most humbly pray your lordship, if being admonished by the street he dwells in, I give him that name, having me in bond for £300 principal, and then he continued on with the letter. And we're going to come back to this word Lombard in a moment. So he then continued and he made a specific complaint to Sir Thomas Egerton as to why Francis thought the arrest was unfair. And the reason, he said, was because he was arrested while he was on the way out from the Tower on Her Majesty's business. And Francis was putting the proposition that it was unfair to be arrested when he was going about Her Majesty's business because that was an insult to the Queen. So in the letter he said, as for contempt, he has offered, in regard to Her Majesty's service, to my understanding, carrieth a privilege, juando et redundo, in meaner causes. Juando et reduando, my Latin is nil, but I understand that means coming and going. So what he was saying is, because I was coming and going on Her Majesty's business, that takes precedence over lesser things like these small debts. He also wrote a second letter to Robert Cecil, Secretary of State, where he laid out pretty much the same information, and he made the same objection. Mr. Simpson might have had me every day in London, and therefore to belay me while he knew I came from the Tower about Her Majesty's special service was, to my understanding, very bold. So these were the specific complaints Francis made about being arrested. So now let's look at Merchant of Venice and the dates. Scholars seem to agree that it was written sometime between 1596 and mid-1598. Now we know mid-1598 is the terminal date because it was registered for publication in the Stationers' Register on July the 22nd of that year. So that was required in those days that every play or book be registered for approval. So this means that the play was certainly completed and written by July the 22nd, 1598. Some 3 months before Francis's arrest. The play was certainly performed in 1598. There's a book called Pallidus Tamia, or Wit's Treasury, in which the author named 6 Shakespeare plays which were known on the stage at that time, and Merchant of Venice is named as one of them. So although it wasn't published in quarto until 1600, we know for certain that the play existed in 1598 and was completed by July. So look at that. It's absolutely impossible that Francis's arrest could have influenced the writing of The Merchant of Venice. Nevertheless, it is very, very strange because the central plot of Merchant of Venice with the Bond is about a debt and being arrested, virtually the same circumstances. In fact, the amount of money is 3,000 ducats, so there's even a resonance there with the £300. So we have a doubt. Our beginning doubt is that Bacon's arrest could not possibly have influenced this play. So what's going on? Well, strangely enough, Francis did actually insert his arrest into another play, but it's not The Merchant of Venice. For this we need to turn to the play of Henry IV, Part 2. And in this play, the character of Falstaff is arrested for the non-payment of a debt for hospitality that he owed to a Mistress Quickly. Now in this case, the play of Henry IV, Part 2 has been dated to sometime between 1598 and mid to late 1559. In fact, Henry IV, Part 1 and 2 are considered to follow immediately on from Merchant of Venice. So that's very interesting already that the plays are connected in time. But let's have a closer look at that. In Act 2, Scene 1, Mistress Quickly requires and asks a couple of fellows to arrest him, and this is Fang. Snare, we must arrest Sir John Falstaff. Mistress Quickly says of Falstaff, he is indicted to dinner to the Lubber's Head in Lombard Street, to Master Smooths, the silkman. Now the Lubber's Head is the Leopard's Head. It's an Elizabethan way of saying Leopard's Head. And Lombard Street, we'll come back to this in a second, but that is Lombard Street. And you might recall from a few slides ago that this is what Francis actually called Giles Simpson, a Lombard. Well, so they go ahead and arrest Falstaff, and he's quite put out by this, and he blusters and he fusses around, and he says to the Lord Chief Justice, who appears on the scene at that moment, "My lord, I say to you, I do desire deliverance from these officers, being upon hasty employment in the king's affairs." So look at that. Falstaff complains about being arrested because at that moment he happens to be doing some business for the king. Now how extraordinary. You could probably search all the history books to find an example of somebody else complaining of that very reason for being arrested. And here we have Bacon making this complaint, and the very next year the play of Henry IV putting the same complaint in the mouth of Falstaff. So just to look at the parallels, Falstaff being upon hasty employment in the king's affairs. Bacon, he was about Her Majesty's special service. And we also have this very interesting connection between Lombard Street and Lombard Street. Now this is the only occasion in the entire works of Shakespeare where this Lombard Street is mentioned, or the word Lombard is even mentioned. The only occasion. So what does it mean, and why was Francis apologising for calling him a Lombard? Well, it's a fascinating story. For this we need to look at the history of Jews in England. Well, as it happens, there were actually no Jews in England in the 1590s, and the reason was because they had all been expelled in the year 1290. And until 1655, when they were formally permitted to return, there were no Jews. The only exception to that is that if they had converted to Christianity, they were called conversos and they were permitted to stay. Now the Jews had been the moneylenders up to that time, but it meant that there was a gap in the market for moneylenders in England. And that gap was filled by goldsmiths who'd come from Italy, from Lombardy. And they set up shop in London, and in fact they set up in what came to be called Lombard Street, and is called Lombard Street to this day. And Lombard Street was full of goldsmiths, pawnbrokers and moneylenders. Now there's a bit of an overlap in a sense, even though there weren't any Jews supposedly in England, there's a bit of an overlap between this term Lombard and Jew. And in fact there was a historical occasion, 1376, where complaints were made that some of those trading as Lombards were actually Jews. So this word Lombard was a very highly charged word, and it meant moneylender, it meant foreigner, it meant Jew, it meant goldsmith. So this is why Francis used the word but kind of apologised at the same time, because it was, as I say, a highly charged word. All right, so now I want to start looking at some of these questions that we asked at the beginning of the talk. And I want to start by looking at the relationship between Antonio and Bassanio. So they're the two lead characters in the play, Antonio and Bassanio. Antonio is the elder of the two. And it's clear from their exchanges that Bassanio has been borrowing frequently from Antonio. And yet Antonio is perfectly willing to keep lending to Bassanio, and even willing to stand bond for Bassanio's debts, which is what happens in the play, of course. Now this is a bit odd, because normally in life one doesn't lend money to one's friends quite that happily, and certainly if it's been going on for a while. So the question that really hangs over this part of the play is, why is it that Antonio is so willing to lend money to Bassanio? Now the standard reason that orthodoxy has settled on these days is because that there was a homosexual relationship between the two of them. And you'll see that in the movie that was made a few years ago with Jeremy Irons. You will see that that's being hinted at, even though it's not laid out in the play. It's become now considered the answer to this question. And we're going to come back to that in a second. But now I want to compare Antonio and Bassanio to these two fine-looking fellows. This is Anthony Bacon, the only known picture of him, on the left, and Francis Bacon on the right. They were the youngest sons, the fourth and the fifth sons of Sir Nicholas Bacon. Anthony was the older, born in 1558. Francis came along in 1561. They were very, very close from the beginning. Their mother, Anne Bacon, one of the most educated women in England at her time, spoke French, Latin, Greek, Spanish, Hebrew and Italian. She oversaw their education, which happened together. And then in 1573, she packed the two brothers off to Trinity College, Cambridge, to be educated. The next thing that happens to them after Cambridge is that Francis gets sent to France, and he goes there in 1576, and he accompanies the ambassador, Sir Amias Paulet. And for 3 years, Francis lived at the court of Henry III. He met all the finest people in France, the high people, the poets. He learnt, well, he could already speak French. And in 1579, when his father died, he returned back to England. But he returned in 1581 and 1582. He returned to the continent and did a tour of France, Italy and Spain. Anthony then moved to live in France in 1580, and he lived there for 12 years. Including visits to the court of Henry IV. He was on very good terms with many of the courtiers there and many of the poets of the day. We don't know very much about Anthony's life. There's only been one biographical study, and it's this wonderful book, Golden Lads, by Daphne du Maurier, Sir Francis Bacon, Anthony Bacon and their friends, published I think in the 70s. She was actually a Baconian, but she keeps it under the lid in this book, and she doesn't actually try to claim any connection with Shakespeare, although she does drop a few tantalising hints. But she explores the life of Anthony Bacon, particularly in France, through the letters that have existed, and then his life after he gets back in 1592. Now I just want to go back to this point about Francis visiting the continent in 1581, because it's a very, very crucial point. And in fact, it's become accepted wisdom. If you go to your local bookshop and peruse the Shakespeare section, if you find any book about who wrote Shakespeare and pull it out and look up Francis Bacon, they will tell you, multiple volumes, all repeat this same thing, that Francis couldn't have written Shakespeare because he never went to Italy. And whoever wrote the plays for Shakespeare must have been to Italy, because they display such an intimate knowledge of Italian life in so many plays. Now, in fact, this is completely wrong. Francis definitely went to Italy, and it's absolutely provable beyond a shadow of a doubt. Here's William Smedley from The Mystery of Francis Bacon, 1912. In 1631 was published in Paris a translation of the Silva Silvarum as the Histoire naturelle de Monsieur Francis Bacon. Prefixed to it is a chapter entitled Discourse sur la vie de Monsieur Francis Bacon. It definitely states that during his youth Bacon travelled to Italy and Spain, which fact is today unrecognised by those who are accepted as authorities in his life. And 100 years later, it's still unrecognised by those who are accepted as authority on his life. There's some other proofs as well. There's some letters that pertain to these journeys he made, but it's certainly the case that Francis went to Italy, and you'll see later that this becomes crucial. So let's quickly run over some biographical details now about Francis and Anthony to orient ourselves. Francis was the youngest son of Sir Nicholas Bacon, left penniless in his father's will. Up until the age of 40, he had no apparent source of income. He was constantly in debt through those years, borrowing frequently from all kinds of people, including his brother. Now, there's a great mystery hidden here, and part of the mystery is that his entire output of work in that time was the one slim volume of the essays that came out in 1597, which is a mere 12 short essays. This from a man who, he said he could execute like a clerk of the works. He never let a moment slip by, and yet up until his 40th year, his entire output was this one slim volume of essays. So the question is, what was he doing? Well, Anthony returned in 1592 to London, and he lodged with Francis at Gray's Inn. And they must have been so happy to be back together again because they were so close throughout their entire life. In 1594, he moved into his own lodgings in Bishopsgate, quite near the Bull Inn, where plays were being performed in those days. Then in 1596, he took up residence with the Earl of Essex, and he became very heavily involved with Essex. And then he dies shortly after Essex lost his head in 1601. So in the 1590s, we have Anthony and Francis living in London, both heavily in debt, both borrowing money, although Anthony had some land and some means and resources. And this is when, of course, the Shakespeare plays started really appearing. Now, there's a very interesting letter here, and there's many letters that show that Francis was borrowing heavily at the time, but this letter is particularly interesting in relation to what we're talking about. So I'll just read out this short extract. It's from Francis Bacon to Mr. Skinner. Well, he opens with some pleasantries, and then he says, "Sir, I most earnestly to request you to pleasure me with the loan of £300. My occasion to employ the same presently is important. My meaning, though I say it myself, is entirely as it ought to be, to satisfy you without fail at the day, and your assurance shall be my brother Anthony Bacon's and my own bond." So here we have documentary evidence that Anthony was willing to stand bond for debts that Francis was incurring. Now at this point I want to read you out a paragraph or two which Spedding, Francis's orthodox biographer, comments at this time when he's talking about this period of their lives. The winter of 1594 set in early with frost and snow, and still no solicitor appointed. Francis was trying to get an appointment as solicitor to pay the bills. Meanwhile, the burden of debt and the difficulty of obtaining necessary supplies was daily increasing. Anthony's correspondence during this autumn is full of urgent applications to various friends for loans of money, much of his own necessity arising from his anxiety to supply the necessities of his brother. It is not often, I suppose, that a relation of debtor and creditor like this continues long, even between the best friends, without making their intercourse more or less uncomfortable, especially when the lender has no good an excuse for objecting to fresh demands, not able to lend more without embarrassing himself and placing himself under fresh obligations to other acquaintance. It is worth recording, therefore, says Spedding, that in all this correspondence I find no trace of disagreement between these brothers. Not a word of reproof, expostulation, reluctance or impatience drops from Anthony. Though his temper had much of the irritability as well as the generosity which commonly belongs to an affectionate nature, the fact deserves notice, not merely for the honour which it reflects upon himself, but as affording a very strong presumption that he at least, who had the best means of judging and was in every way so much interested, did not disapprove the course which Francis was taking, or suspect him of prodigality or carelessness. So Spedding's making it clear that as far as Anthony was concerned, whatever this money was going on was completely legitimate and above board, wasn't being frittered away. Now at this point I'd like to quote from the first scene of Merchant of Venice. And here is the bit where Bassanio is asking Antonio if he can borrow some more money from him. He says, "My chief care is to come fairly off from the great debts wherein my time, something too prodigal, has left me engaged. To you, Antonio, I owe the most, in money and in love. And from your love I have a warranty to unburden all my plots and purposes, how to get clear of all the debts I owe. And then Antonio answers in this way. I pray you, good Bassanio. I pray you, good Bassanio. Let me know it. And if it stand, as you yourself still do, within the eye of honour, be assured, my purse, my person, my extremest means lie all unlocked to your occasions. Now, how extraordinary. The relationship there between Antonio and Bassanio in the play is precisely the same as Spedding points out between the brothers in real life. Antonio was perfectly happy to keep loaning money and considered that there was nothing prodigal or wasteful about the reason for this. So what was the relationship between the two of them? Were they homosexual lovers, as contemporary criticism would have it? Well, in fact, no, that's absolutely impossible. And it's impossible because the playwright does actually make it perfectly clear what the relationship between them is. When Bassanio first steps onto the stage, Salanio, who's addressing Antonio, says, "Here comes Bassanio, your most noble kinsman." Now, kinsman can only mean one thing. There's no ambiguity. It means family. Antonio and Bassanio are family. How fascinating. So I want to suggest today, as the first layer of our examination of the hidden scaffolding of Merchant of Venice, that Antonio represents Anthony Bacon and Bassanio represents Francis Bacon. Now you can see already that you don't have to do terribly much to the names to even extract the names. Antonio, Anthony, and here Bassanio is clearly a riff on the word bacon. Well, maybe, we shall see. Now, of course, that doesn't prove that Francis wrote the play. Anyone could have written it and anyone could have glanced at these two characters. But certainly the biography of Anthony and Francis through the 1590s and their relationship happens to correspond precisely with the relationship between the two characters of Antonio and Bassanio in Merchant of Venice. So let's move on to our next question. Why is Antonio sad at the beginning of the play? Well, many scholarly articles have been written on this. There's all kinds of reasons. Again, he's got frustrated homosexual love, apparently, for Bassanio. That's one of the reasons. Well, let's just look at their first two lines. This is the first line that Antonio speaks. This is the first line of the play. "In sooth, I know not why I am so sad." And then several pages of discussion of his sadness. And then Bassanio enters, and this is Bassanio's first line. "Good seniors both, when shall we laugh? Say when." So already there's a contrast there, isn't there, between those two? One of them is sad, one of them's laughing. Well, it's really quite extraordinary how scholars have missed this, but no one seems to have picked up what's going on here. My mind was twigged by the very last sentence of Daphne du Maurier's book, Golden Lads. The very last sentence of her book, she quotes this quote from Montaigne's essays of 1580. And by the way, Anthony was very good friends with Montaigne, and they certainly knew about his essays. Well, this is the last sentence of the Golden Lads by Daphne du Maurier. "Democritus and Heraclitus were two philosophers, of whom the first, finding the condition of man vain and ridiculous, never went out in public but with a mocking and laughing face. Whereas Heraclitus, having pity and compassion on this same condition of ours, wore a face perpetually sad and eyes filled with tears." Well, it's not so much well known these days, but in those days it was very well known. The two philosophers, Democritus and Heraclitus, were paired together. They're called the laughing philosopher and the weeping philosopher. And in fact, you will see many artworks from that time depicting this polarity of the two characters. Here's a classic image from one of the emblem books, which were very popular at the time. And here we have, over here, we have Democritus, the laughing philosopher, and here we have Heraclitus, the weeping philosopher. This is a painting by Rubens in 1603. Here's Democritus laughing over here. Here's Heraclitus frowning and weeping over here. And they're depicted on a globe. And almost inevitably, when artists depicted Heraclitus and Democritus, they are pictured with a globe. Here's another couple of paintings. This is by Terbruygen in 1628, a little bit later. There's Heraclitus over on the right, leaning on his globe. And here's Bassanio. Here's Democritus over on this side, laughing. So it was a very common idea at the time of pairing these two philosophers together, the laughing philosopher and the weeping philosopher. is also related to the idea of the masks which have come to represent theatre, the mask of comedy and the mask of tragedy. Now, in this case, this isn't actually specifically a depiction of Heraclitus and Democritus. The laughing mask represents Thalia, the muse of comedy. The weeping mask, Melpomene, the muse of tragedy. However, even in those days, they were associated with Heraclitus and Democritus. There's a theatre in Amsterdam which they've discovered all the original drawings from it, and there's a poem over the stage which has these masks and a poem talking about Heraclitus and Democritus and mapping the two laughing and weeping philosophers onto these symbols of comedy and tragedy. So is it possible that the author of the play really was glancing at Democritus and Heraclitus? Well, there's a very solid hint that he drops in the very next scene where Portia actually mentions the weeping philosopher. I fear he will prove the weeping philosopher when he grows old, she says of one of the suitors who's come. That's a direct reference to Heraclitus. So certainly we can be certain that the author of the play had Heraclitus and Democritus on his mind. So is it possible that Heraclitus somehow represents Antonio and Democritus represents Bassanio or Francis? Well, at this point I pull out a quote from Ben Jonson, who said of Francis Bacon, his language, where he could spare or pass by a jest, was nobly censorious. In other words, he was saying Francis could not stop himself from cracking jokes constantly. Whatever he was doing, whatever he was talking about, it was filled with jests. Here we have Francis Bacon's essays, which were published in 1597. They're actually dedicated to his brother Anthony, of whom he says, "You that are next to myself." And in the second essay on discourse, here's the quote. "It is good," says Francis, "in discourse and speech of conversation, to vary and intermingle speech of the present occasion with arguments, tales with reasons, asking of questions with tellings of opinions, and jest with earnest." So here's Francis urging in discourse that jest be mixed with earnest. When we have a serious topic, it's a good idea to mix it up with something funny. Now, there are many other quotes that where he also refers to the same kind of idea, but there's one. So here's the second layer I'm going to suggest for Merchant of Venice. Antonio represents Anthony Bacon, but he also represents the weeping philosopher Heraclitus, and this is why he's sad. Meanwhile, Bassanio, who is Francis Bacon, represents Democritus, and this is why he steps on stage and says, "When shall we laugh? Say when." So now we're starting to excavate some of these hidden archaeology. So let's move on to the next question now. So we all know the famous story. Antonio borrows the money on behalf of, well, in fact, Bassanio actually borrows the money, but Antonio stands bond. And the money's being borrowed from Shylock. And the terms, Shylock agrees, but he says, "I won't charge you interest. What I will do is I will lend you the 3,000 ducats for 3 months on the condition that if you don't pay in the 3 months, you will give me a pound of your flesh," the famous pound of flesh. Well, Antonio says, "No problem. I've got ships coming in. I've got so many ships. I'm going to have so much money by then. This isn't even a risk. I will take it. Let's do it." They sign the bond. And then things go horribly awry. And as those of you who watch the play have known. So, well, why is it? Why does Shylock want this pound of flesh? Well, as I say, the playwright never actually explains it. Well, here's an interesting thought that occurred to me going back 10 years ago. And once the thought had occurred to me, well, I couldn't get it out of my head. And the thought is this. If Antonio and Bassanio really are the Bacon brothers, then the pound of flesh, work with me here, would be a pound of bacon. Okay? All right. Now, when you first think of that, you think, yes, well, that's kind of a bad joke. That's a funny, bad pun. It can't be what's going on. But the more you think about it in the context of the play, the more fascinating this idea becomes. Now, these points that I put up here, these are apparent to orthodox scholars. If you read any book of essays on Merchant of Venice, these are the very things that are brought up by scholars. First of all, the play is full of metaphors of dining and eating. They're constantly talking about going to dinner and whether or not they're going to have dinner. And they're constantly talking about pork. We'll get to that in a moment. There's also a sense that scholars explore of, within the play, men eating each other up as a metaphor for borrowing money, for usury. And the related ideas that go with this, men eating each other up, lending money with interest and then devouring the other person, bringing up ideas of even of cannibalism and of fears of mutual incorporation. Well, there's some extraordinary essays exploring these kind of ideas. But the play also highlights the idea of pork, and we'll see that in a moment. That pork and pork eating play a central role in the play as a marker of the cultural difference between the Jews and the Christians in the play. And there are many, many quotations which bear this out, which we'll see in a moment. But I want to bring up something now about this bond. Shylock twice describes this bond as a merry bond, or merry sport. Go with me to a notary, he says to Antonio. Seal me there your single bond. And in a merry sport, if you repay me not on such a day, in such a place, such sums as are expressed in the condition, let the forfeit be nominated for an equal pound of your fair flesh. Elsewhere, he says, then meet me forthwith at the notary's. Give him direction for this merry bond. Now again, there's been much scholarly ink spilt on why on earth Shylock could possibly be describing this bond as merry. Because on the face of it, there's nothing merry at all about hacking out a pound of flesh from the other person in relation to a debt. So there's really no good reason within the play that anyone has been able to come up with as to why the pound of flesh should be described as a merry bond. So here already we're starting to see how these ideas really start ricocheting through the play. If the pound of flesh is a pound of bacon, if it really is a pun, then here is our element of merriness. And here we have the author mixing jest with earnest. There's several references to pork in the play. Now the word bacon does not actually occur in the play anywhere, but there's this very fascinating line that Lancelot says after some discussion on the fact that turning Jews into Christians is going to have a terrible effect because it's going to raise the price of hogs. Lancelot then picks up on this theme and says, this raising of Christians will raise the price of hogs. If we grow all to be pork eaters, we shall not have a rasher on the coals for money. Now how fascinating. He's dancing around the concept of bacon here without actually saying the word. We've got hogs, we've got pork eaters, we've got rasher, and in fact this is one of the first occurrences of the word rasher in the English language. If you look up the etymology, they date it to the 1590s. There's actually one or two earlier references which are in themselves rather fascinating. But here we have one of the first references to the idea of a rasher, which means a thin slice of bacon. And it's a rasher because it will cook fast. It's a rash, it's quick. So here we have the playwright walking right up to the concept of bacon and yet not actually saying the word and backing away. But it's not only that reference. In the very first scene, they invite Shylock to have dinner with them. Shylock says no, he's not going to come to dinner because that would involve to smell pork, to eat of the habitation which your prophet the Nazarite conjured the devil into. And there he's referring to the story in the Gospels where Jesus summons the demons from a madman into a herd of swine, and they all then rush off the hills, off the cliff into a lake. I will buy with you, sell with you, talk with you, walk with you, and so following, but I will not eat with you, drink with you, nor pray with you, says Shylock. Nevertheless, a couple of scenes later, Shylock does actually go and dine with Antonio, and again, there's been much scholarly comment on why, having said this, he should be so keen afterwards to do it. He also says later, when he's being asked why he wants the pound of flesh, and he's giving his reasons, and he's developing this idea that, well, people have their own ideas of what they want and what they don't want, and these are all very individual things. And the very first of the examples that he gives, he says, some men there are like not a gaping pig. Now, what is a gaping pig? A gaping pig is a pig with its mouth open. In other words, a pig that's been roasted whole for eating with a baked apple in its mouth. Now, that reminds me of a very good joke, which I'm going to tell you now. It's a Jewish joke, actually, and I came across this joke on a fascinating blog written by a Jewish New Yorker who is a cook or a chef who is fascinated by the relationship of Jewishness to pork. And this blog is actually exploring the whole complex set of relationships between Jews and pork. Of course, Orthodox Jews won't eat pork, but secular Jews find themselves eating it, and all kinds of issues arise. Well, on this blog he has this lovely joke, and I'm going to tell you the joke now. So there was an Orthodox rabbi, and he had a secret hankering to eat pork. But of course, he couldn't be seen to be eating pork. So one day, he set out for a town that was far enough away that he would be certain that no one would see him. So he went to this town, and he went to the restaurant, and he sat down and he ordered himself a whole roast suckling pig. And he sat back to wait for it to be delivered. Well, it was delivered to his table, and that exact moment, a couple from his synagogue walked into the restaurant. And there they saw their rabbi and the roast suckling pig on the table in front, and they said, "Rabbi, fancy seeing you here. What's going on?" And the rabbi says, "I ordered a baked apple, and look how they served it." Well, that's a gaping pig. So, in some sense, there's an idea here behind all this what seems like a bad joke when you first hear it. The more you start thinking about this, you see that Bacon, and I'm getting ahead of myself, but I'm just going to say Bacon is riffing on, one of the things he's riffing on is the idea that of Jews secretly wanting to eat pork. Well, it's really more widespread than that. It's like the thing that is forbidden to us is always the thing that we have a secret repressed desire to eat. So the suggestion behind the idea here is that the reason Shylock wants the pound of flesh is because he's got a repressed desire to eat bacon. Now the references don't stop there. Portia, who of course is the woman that Bassanio needs the money in order to woo, to become a suitor, her name is Portia. Now of her, Bassanio says when he's introducing her, her name is Portia, nothing undervalued to Cato's daughter, Brutus's Portia. Now he's referring there to a real person. Her name was Portia Catonus. She lived, there's the dates. She was the daughter of Cato, and Wikipedia tells me that her name is spelt Porcia, but it's occasionally spelt Portia, as it is in the play, especially in 18th century English literature. She was a Roman woman, she was the daughter of Cato and the wife of Brutus. But her name is the feminine version of the Roman family name Porcius, which means pig. It's derived from the Latin porcus. So how extraordinary. Now we'll see later on when we explore the sources of the play that in the source, the original source, the woman who represents Portia doesn't have any name. So the author of the play was free to choose whatever name he wanted for Portia, any name in the entire constellation of the history of female names, and he chose the name that means pig. Now on the face of it, why would you pick the name of your leading lady to be pig? It's not a very complimentary term. Well, she's going to become the wife of Bacon, and so Bacon is sitting back there laughing his head off, could not pass by or spare a jest. But this is by no means the end of it. It turns out that the concept of usury comes from the Hebrew, from the Bible, has all these restrictions on what you can and can't do. And the Hebrew word for usury is nashak, which means to lend upon usury or to bite. It's the same word. A primitive root, and this is from Strong's Concordance, nashak means to strike with a sting, as in a serpent, figuratively, to oppress with interest on a loan, to bite or to lend upon usury. So the very concept of usury itself, when we trace it back, is intertwined with the idea of biting. Now, I'm sure there will be very few people today who would be aware of that fact, but in Bacon's day it was actually quite a commonplace. And in fact, we can turn to Francis Bacon's essay on usury, 1625, in which he says, and he's talking about the conditions under which usury should be permitted. It appears by the balance of commodities and discommodities of usury, two things are to be reconciled. The one, that the tooth of usury be grinded, that it bite not too much. The other, that there be left open a means to invite moneyed men to lend to the merchants for the continuing and quickening of trade. So Bacon's idea in this essay was that there should be two rates of usury, one low rate for the common people when they really needed some extra money, but then a proper decent rate for merchants. So he uses the metaphor here of grinding the tooth of usury. And so he's doing that because he's very familiar with this idea that usury and biting usury and the tooth are intimately related concepts. So now when we come back to the idea of the pound of bacon, men eating each other up, literally taking a chunk or a bite out of another person, it's an entirely appropriate metaphor to use in regards to usury. Okay, so now we've started to excavate a couple of the layers. We have Francis and Antony as Antonio and Bassanio. We have Heraclitus and Democritus, and we have the pound of flesh. Now, you may or may not be convinced yet by these propositions. So I'd like to introduce something absolutely remarkable that occurs in the first folio version of the play. Here it is. This is the first page of The Merchant of Venice from the first folio. And here's where it starts over here. In sooth, I know not why I am so sad. And I put a red box around this passage here, which, as you can see, is right next to the opening of the play in quite a prominent space there. So there I've blown it up. There you can see, here is this passage. I'm going to zoom right in on this passage and we're going to have a good close look at it. So here it is. And this is now, they've been talking to Antonio for half a page, trying to work out why he's sad. And well, there's no good reason. He's not in love, etc., etc. Okay, so Salanio says, not in love, neither? Well then, let us say you are sad because you are not merry. And 'twere as easy for you to laugh and leap and say you are merry because you're not sad. Now, by two-headed Janus, nature has framed strange fellows in her time. Okay, so what's he saying here? He's bringing in the idea of Janus, the Roman god of beginnings and endings, the god of January, the god of doorways, who looks two ways. He has two faces, Janus, as you recall. One face looks to the past and one face looks to the future. But here, the playwright is not talking about two faces looking to the past and the future. He's talking about two faces that are sad and merry, or merry and sad. So the playwright is overlaying over the idea of Janus, the idea of merry and sad, sad and merry. Now, in fact, there's one recent book by a scholar on this who is happy to point out in a footnote that this is a reference to Heraclitus and Democritus. And yet this particular author, John LePage, a very fascinating book, but he then goes on to say, well, it's not clear who Shakespeare could have had in mind within the play as to who could be Heraclitus and Democritus. Well, I think we can actually go one step further, and I think we can be certain who Heraclitus and Democritus were in the play. But look at this. We've got two-headed Janus referring to Heraclitus and Democritus put into one person. Now I want to show you something utterly remarkable about this passage. I've highlighted the beginning letters of these 5 lines. This middle line begins with an F. And here we've got because and nature. So we can read, if you like, if you'll work with me here, F, beacon. F, beacon. Okay? But the same thing happens if we go northwards. F, beacon. Can you see that? The start of 4, because and not. F, beacon. So there we go. We've got one F beacon heading downwards from the F, and we've got a second F beacon heading up from the F. We've got a Janus face. We've got two faces looking in two different directions. This is really an extraordinary thing because not only is it an acrostic of Francis Bacon's name, it's a double acrostic in the very passage that's bringing up the word Janus. Now, in fact, in the entire works of Shakespeare, Janus is only mentioned twice. The other occasion is in Othello, and it's a passing reference which is really, it applies to what's going on. There's nothing mysterious about it. We can kind of throw it away. So this is really the key reference to Janus in the entire Shakespeare plays. It seems to be brought in for no really good reason, and yet it has this extraordinary double-headed acrostic at the beginning. Here it is blown up so you can have a really good look at it. F beacon, F beacon. Now the Elizabethans loved these kinds of games with acrostics and words, and we'll see a couple of examples later on. But you might be saying, well, okay, all right, but it's misspelt, isn't it? It's not F bacon. It would be even better if this E was an A and this was an O and it was perfect F bacon. Well, yes and no. Yes, it would be better, Maybe not though, because it would be kind of too obvious, right? So it's a little bit hidden. So the question is it acceptable within the games of Elizabethan literature to slightly alter someone's name for the purpose of making this kind of games? Well, it absolutely is. And I've got a lovely example for you here. This is from the works of Sir John Davies, who was a poet at the time and who was actually a very good friend of Francis Bacon's. And this is as it appears in Sir John Davies' collected works. It's a poem dedicated to Francis Bacon, about Francis. To the Right Honourable Sir Francis Bacon, see that? Knight, Lord High Chancellor of England. And we'll just skip to here. Thy virtuous name and office join with fate to make thee the bright beacon of the state. And he's explained what's going on here. It's an anagram. Bacon with an E is an anagram of beacon. So Sir John Davies is leaving on record for us that it is acceptable to use a variation on the name in order to accomplish these kinds of games. And of course, in Elizabethan times, spelling was much more fluid than it is now. They didn't have a sense of spelling being locked in. Well, now if we flip to the front of the first folio, there's something really remarkable. This is the page that lists the names of the actors in the acting company that performed the Shakespeare plays. And the first one is William Shakespeare, of course. And the W that begins the word William is a large illuminated W. Now I've blown it up for you so you can see it here. And as you can see, this illuminated W contains a Janus face. Two faces joined together. And if you also see, it's very small on the original, but you can see that this guy's laughing and this guy's frowning. So Bacon has actually illustrated on the front page a Janus face of Heraclitus and Democritus. Now that's very unusual. In fact, when I was putting this together, I actually tried to find another example of someone illustrating Janus in relation to Heraclitus and Democritus. In other words, I tried to find a picture of Janus with a laughing and a weeping face. I actually could not find one. I could not find one. So this is unique. There is no one else depicting Janus with two different faces, smiling and laughing as they are here. So I would suggest that the... do we need to stop here or something?
Just a tape change.
Okay, quick tape change. Quick pause. So yeah, I'd like to suggest that this illuminated W here is a key directed directly to this particular passage in Merchant of Venice, where Francis is hiding this secret set of identifications, that Janus represents merry and sad, sad and merry, Democritus and Heraclitus, Antonio and Bassanio, Francis and Anthony. And there it is, I put it next to it just so you can see it one more time. So we have, this is really extraordinary. We have a passage that mentions Janus. We have the double-headed acrostic identifying it in the margin. And then we have an actual picture of Janus at the front of the first folio with the happy and sad faces. I think that's really an extraordinary thing. All right, so let's summarise now the layers that we've put together. The characters are Antonio and Bassanio. The Bacon brothers are Anthony and Francis. The philosophers are Heraclitus and Democritus, the weeping and the laughing philosopher. They also map onto the ideas of tragedy and comedy. And the whole thing is the archetype is two-headed Janus.